I'm a lumberjack, and I have concrete evidence that Bigfoot tried to kill me on my logging property. Less than 24 hours after I got the proof, my entire life changed forever because of the terrible thing that happened next. And the reason why Bigfoot wanted me dead is one of the most absurd things I've ever heard. My land sits on 40 acres of old-growth mixed conifer in a valley that barely appears on county maps. My grandfather logged the outer stands in the 60s. My father worked the eastern ridge in the 80s. 3 weeks ago, I brought 8 experienced men onto the property to reach the oldest timber we had left. The land had been in my family for generations, a private timber parcel that had avoided the larger logging operations around it. For the first 2 days, everything went exactly how 30 years in logging told me it should. But then one of my crew members called me over to a tree near the western ridge. At first, I thought he'd found another set of those strange markings we'd been seeing. Instead, he was standing beside a section of exposed roots where recent erosion had cut into the hillside. Human bones were sticking out of the dirt. We spent the next hour clearing away loose soil. The deeper we dug, the worse it got. There wasn't one skeleton. There were several. Some looked decades old. Others looked far more recent. Mixed in with the remains were rusted belt buckles, watches, pocket knives, and pieces of clothing. Then I found the marks. The same deep grooves we'd been seeing on the trees were carved directly into the exposed rock behind the burial site. I photographed everything. Looking back, I think that's when Bigfoot decided I wasn't leaving the property alive. I had seen every kind of damage the forest could create, but this was different. And when we checked the surrounding trees, we found the same marks repeated across the entire section. Whatever left them wasn't hiding. It was marking territory, and we had just walked into it. The next morning, I found the chainsaws lined across the tailgate of my truck. At first, I thought they had been damaged during cutting, but when I checked them closer, several chains had been pulled loose, teeth were damaged, and the bars showed deep scratches along the metal. It looked less like normal wear and more like something had interfered with the equipment after we left. By the afternoon, the mood had changed. The younger members of my crew stopped joking and started watching the tree line instead of the equipment. We spent hours checking for signs of bears, falling timber, or anything else that could explain what happened. When we still couldn't find an answer, 2 of them told me they weren't coming back until we figured out what we were dealing with. I understood why. After 30 years in those woods, I knew when something felt wrong, but I also knew I wasn't going to leave without answers. So I opened the backup case locked inside my truck, pulled out a fresh chain, and went back to work. The next morning, every replacement chain inside the case had been twisted beyond use. The lock was still intact, but the steel links looked like they had been crushed together under enormous pressure. That wasn't the part that bothered me. The part that bothered me was finding fresh footprints around the truck. Something had been standing there while I slept. Something large enough to destroy hardened steel with its hands. I should have packed up and left. Instead, I stayed one more night. I set up my tent, kept my rifle beside my sleeping bag, and told myself whatever was out there had only been sending a message. It hadn't come after me. Not yet. That night, something came close enough to answer. Around midnight, with the fire reduced to glowing coals and the entire logging site completely silent, I heard something outside the canvas. Not footsteps, not branches moving, not an animal passing through the brush. Breathing, heavy, slow, and close enough that the side of the tent moved slightly with each exhale. I was awake instantly. My rifle was in my hands before I was even fully sitting up, and for a few seconds I just stared at the fabric wall separating me from whatever was standing on the other side. Then the tent shifted again. Something was there. Something large enough that I could see the outline pressing against the darkness. I raised the rifle and aimed at the outline pressing against the canvas, but I didn't fire immediately. 30 years in the woods had taught me one thing. Shooting at something you cannot identify is how people get themselves killed. I shouted once, no response. The shape outside didn't move. It just kept breathing. A rifle shot in the middle of a silent forest doesn't sound like a noise. It sounds like the entire mountain splitting open. Every animal I had ever encountered reacted the same way. Birds scatter, deer run, predators disappear into cover. Anything that understands danger moves away from it. Whatever was outside my tent didn't move immediately. For several seconds, everything went completely still. Then I heard movement again, not running away, but shifting farther back into the trees. It wasn't a normal animal call. It wasn't a roar or a warning sound. It was low, deep, and coming from somewhere close enough that I could feel the vibration through the ground beneath me. Whatever was standing outside had just heard a rifle fired directly at it, and instead of leaving, it stayed. Then it started moving. One step, another step, a pause, then another 2 steps. The breathing stopped. Then something slammed into the side of the tent. The impact threw me sideways across the sleeping pad. Before I could react, another hit came from a different direction. Tent poles snapped. The fabric collapsed inward. Whatever was outside wasn't investigating anymore. It was trying to get in. For hours, the movement never settled into a pattern I could understand. Sometimes it was close enough that I could hear weight shifting outside the tent. Sometimes it disappeared completely, only to return from a different direction minutes later. It wasn't wandering, it was checking. Massive footprints pressed into the dirt around the campsite. Some were deeper than others, especially near the softer ground beside the fire pit. The tracks suggested something had moved around the camp slowly, stopping and changing direction several times before leaving. It had walked a complete circle around me and stopped exactly where it started. I looked at those tracks for a long time because that was when I realized the rifle shot hadn't scared it away. It had been waiting, and when I followed the tracks toward the edge of the logging road, I found out the night wasn't about the tent at all. Something had happened while I was trapped inside that circle. The main road out of the interior ran about a mile to the county fire road, one lane of packed gravel cutting through the trees, straight enough that I could see the junction from the first bend on a clear day. I came around that bend in my truck expecting an open road, and instead I found a wall of timber across the entire path, 8 feet high and almost 40 feet deep. At first I thought it was a collapse from the ridge, some kind of massive wind throw, but the closer I got, the less sense it made. These logs weren't scattered. They weren't broken apart. They were placed. The road wasn't blocked by one fallen tree. It was worse than that. Several large trunks had fallen across the road, but what caught my attention was how tightly they were packed together. Some looked like natural falls from the slope, while others appeared to have been moved after they landed. I couldn't tell where coincidence ended and something else began. It wasn't meant to warn me. It was meant to trap me. I spent the entire morning trying to move it. 2 logs, that's all I managed. 2 logs out of the dozens locked together in that wall. My hands were cut up, my back was burning, and I was already thinking about how I was going to need heavier equipment if I wanted to clear it properly. I stepped away for lunch, walked back to camp, heated a can of food, and when I returned, those 2 logs were gone. Not moved, not rolled somewhere nearby. Replaced. New timber sat in the exact same positions with the same overlapping pattern, like nothing had ever been touched. I stood there staring at it because that was the first time I understood the difference between something being strong and something being deliberate. I checked every route out of that valley after that, every trail I had used for years, every creek crossing my father had shown me, every ridge path and drainage line I knew by memory. 2 routes I depended on were suddenly unusable. The creek crossing had logs placed across the bank with branches woven through the gaps. The ridge route had a fallen tree positioned at the exact point where the slope became too steep to get around. The road wasn't the only problem. The creek crossing I normally used was also blocked by fallen timber, and another trail had become impossible after a section of the slope collapsed. 2 routes I had depended on for years were suddenly unusable. Whether it was coincidence or something else, I was running out of easy ways back. I walked the perimeter of the property, trying not to think about what that meant, because there is a difference between being lost and realizing something has decided where you can and cannot go. When I returned to camp, something else was waiting for me. Fresh footprints surrounded the folding chair beside my fire pit. Not the campsite, the chair. 1 print on either side of it, another directly behind it. Whatever made them had stood exactly where my head would have been if I'd still been sitting there. The fire had been cold for hours, which meant it had happened while I was gone checking the property. I stared at those tracks longer than I want to admit, because there was no practical reason for anything to stand there. It wasn't looking for food. It wasn't passing through. It had been standing over the exact spot where I usually sat. Then I found the tree. It was 50 feet from where I had been sitting earlier eating lunch. Fresh marks cut into the trunk. Same pattern, same depth, same downward grooves I had been finding since the beginning. But these marks were different because the sap was still moving, still wet. Whatever made them had been there recently. Close enough that I could have thrown something and hit that tree. I looked back toward the clearing where I had been sitting and tried to remember if I heard anything at all. No footsteps, no brush moving, no warning, nothing. Something had come within 50 feet of me in broad daylight, marked another tree, and disappeared before I could spot it. That wasn't a warning anymore. It was getting comfortable being close to me. That was when I stopped waiting for the next sign. I went back to my truck, grabbed my rifle, and started building a blind at the edge of the largest clearing on the property. I had spent days reacting to whatever was happening out there, but I was done letting it decide when I saw it. I was going to choose the place. I was going to choose the moment. I didn't understand yet that the moment I made that decision, I had finally done exactly what it had been waiting for. Because when Bigfoot stepped out of the tree line and I finally had a clear view of it, I realized the entire 22 days leading up to that moment had only been preparation for what happened next. I built the blind at the edge of a 200-foot clearing with clear sight lines on 3 sides, settled in behind a fallen fir around 9 in the morning, and waited. The wind was coming from the northwest, carrying my scent away from the open ground, and I had the rifle positioned where I could bring it up without making unnecessary movement. After everything that had happened, I knew this was the best chance I was going to get to finally see what had been moving around my property. I sat there for 4 hours without shifting, watching the clearing stay empty while the forest around me continued normally. Birds moved through the canopy. Small animals crossed the brush. Nothing about the sound of the woods felt wrong. Then something moved between 2 pines at the far edge of the clearing. My brain tried to explain it before I could accept what I was seeing. A person, a bear standing upright. Anything that fits into a category I already understood. But nothing matched. The shape stepping out of the trees was too large, too wide, too heavy. It moved with a slow, controlled gait, each step carrying a weight that I could feel through the log beneath me, even from 50 yards away. Dark hair covered its entire body. Its arms hung low enough that the hands nearly reached the ground while it walked. The shoulders were broader than anything I had ever seen in those woods, easily over 8 feet tall. Bigfoot walked into the clearing and stopped. Then it looked directly at me. I had the shot. The rifle was already in my hands. And I fired. The sound exploded across the clearing. I expected the creature to run, because every animal I had encountered in those woods reacted the same way when a gun went off. Instead, it stopped. The bullet hit. I saw the impact. Instead of dropping, the creature snapped its head toward me. The entire expression changed. For the first time since I'd seen it, there was no curiosity left, only aggression. Without taking its eyes off my position, Bigfoot reached down and grabbed a section of fallen timber near the edge of the clearing. The log was thick enough that I would have needed equipment to move it easily. It lifted one side and dragged it across the ground, the timber scraping through the dirt before slamming into the trees beside my blind. Pieces of bark and dirt struck my face. The impact shook the ground beneath me, and I remember sitting there frozen because the message was obvious even without understanding it. It wasn't just that Bigfoot had the strength to move something that heavy. It was that it had the control to put it exactly where it wanted. It could have hit me. I fired 2 more times. The same reaction. Bigfoot ripped a massive section of fallen timber from the ground and hurled it directly at my position. Just that same slow movement of the head, like Bigfoot was studying the sound, studying the weapon, studying me. Then it turned around and walked back into the tree line. No rush. No chase, no sound of branches breaking as it disappeared. It was just gone. I stayed in that blind for another 20 minutes before I trusted myself to move. Then I walked to where the stump had landed and measured the distance. 50 yards, a massive piece of green wood with the root system still attached, thrown with enough accuracy to pass just above where I was hiding. That was the part I couldn't get past. The throw wasn't the point. The point was that Bigfoot wanted me to understand it could do that whenever it wanted. And then it walked away. I should have left after that. I know that now. Instead, I abandoned the tent and locked myself inside the steel cab of my dozer, convinced that a machine weighing several tons would give me some kind of advantage. It didn't, because while I was sitting inside that cab waiting for night to pass, something outside began moving around my equipment. And what Bigfoot did next was the moment I realized the clearing had never been the real encounter. The equipment started making noise one piece at a time about an hour after dark. It had searched my camp before this night ever started. I couldn't tell if whatever was outside was searching through the camp or simply moving through it and destroying whatever was in its path. The fuel cache I had hidden under a tarp 200 feet from the main camp went 20 minutes after the stove. I had buried those drums under brush I arranged myself in a location I picked specifically because it looked untouched. Something walking through that area wouldn't notice it unless it already knew what it was looking for. The sound of those drums being crushed came through the steel walls of the dozer with perfect clarity, and the smell of diesel reached me seconds later. I sat there in the cab staring through the windshield because that was the moment I understood whatever was outside wasn't just damaging things. It had found something I had hidden. It had searched my camp before this night ever started. Then I heard something from outside the cab. At first I thought it was just another strange vocalization. Then it happened again, and it sounded disturbingly close to my own voice, calling out from the dark. Not clear enough to be certain, not close enough to dismiss. It had heard me say it enough times to know what it meant. It sounded disturbingly close to a human voice. The sound that came next was the closest thing I had ever heard to my own voice, coming from somewhere it shouldn't. Slow pauses between each one, like it was testing the sound and waiting to see what I would do. I still don't know how long I sat there before the impact came. One hand struck the side of the cab. The impact wasn't enough to damage the machine, but the sound was enormous. The glass of the side window spiderwebbed instantly. The creature wasn't just touching the machine, it was trying to peel the steel apart to get to me. Through the cracked glass, I caught a glimpse of one eye staring into the cab. It wasn't looking at the machine. It was looking directly at me. When morning came, I opened the door and found my jacket shredded into bloody strips and nailed to a tree with a jagged piece of bone. This wasn't a return of property. It was a promise of what was coming next. The creature had been inches from the glass all night, waiting for me to step out. That was when I stopped thinking about what was happening as simple destruction. Something had been moving closer with every encounter, and every time I thought I understood the pattern, it changed. So I made the decision that nearly got me killed. I stopped waiting for the next message and decided I was going to force an answer myself. I spent the next day setting traps across every approach trail around the property. Every route I knew, every path something would have to take to reach the camp. I had spent 30 years learning how to read the forest, and I convinced myself I finally had a way to read whatever was moving through it. By the next morning, every trap was a scene of carnage, not triggered, but obliterated. And what Bigfoot left behind in their place was the first time I realized the creature wasn't just smart, it was mocking me. I placed motion cameras near the trails, hung noise alarms around the camp, and marked areas where I had found tracks. I wasn't trying to capture whatever was out there. I just needed proof it was moving through the property. Tripwires stretched across the widest paths at chest height based on what I had seen in the clearing, and I spent hours adjusting every trigger, checking every anchor, making sure nothing was loose or obvious. I walked that entire line twice before dark, and for the first time in a week, I felt like I had changed the situation instead of just reacting to it. I had spent days waiting for Bigfoot to make the next move. Now I had put something in the way. In the morning, I was finally going to find out what happened when something that size stepped into a trap built by someone who understood the woods. What I found the next morning was a slaughter. The snare wires were tangled around the carcasses of several deer that had been dragged into the camp and left in a heap. The pitfall depressions were filled with the remains of small animals, crushed and broken. It wasn't disarming the traps. It was showing me that my defenses were useless and that it could kill anything it wanted, whenever it wanted. My tools weren't returned. They were destroyed. The hatchet head was snapped off the handle and driven deep into the steel of the dozer's hood. I realized then that I wasn't being warned. I was being toyed with, like a cat playing with a mouse before the final strike. I grabbed my rifle, knowing it was the only thing between me and a violent death, and I ran. I abandoned the camp, abandoned the equipment, and started moving toward the center clearing because I thought distance was something I could create. I thought if I could get far enough away, I could finally break the pattern and leave the property on my own terms. I was wrong, because by the time I reached that clearing, I wasn't escaping Bigfoot. I was walking exactly where Bigfoot wanted me to go. I moved fast through the interior, taking every evasion technique I'd accumulated across 3 decades of tracking and being tracked in old-growth terrain, doubling back on my own trail at irregular intervals, crossing the creek multiple times to break scent continuity, climbing toward higher ground to change my movement pattern against the terrain. None of it worked. Bigfoot matched me through the trees, always somewhere beyond the brush, close enough that I could hear movement, but never close enough to see clearly. Every time I changed direction, Bigfoot had already adjusted. Every time I stopped, the forest stopped with me. I wasn't escaping. I was being herded. The axe I had lost was suddenly buried in the tree, inches from my head. The force was so great the handle snapped upon impact. It wasn't a warning. If I hadn't tripped on a root, that blade would have split my skull. I didn't look back. I just kept running as the sounds of snapping timber grew closer. Bigfoot exploded from the tree line at the edge of the creek. The entire forest seemed to move with it. Branches snapped. Small trees bent and broke as the massive shape came straight through the old growth instead of around it. There was no stalking anymore. No circling. No hiding. It was charging. I hit loose shale near the creek bank and went down hard. My rifle flew from my hands and skidded across the rocks. I scrambled after it, but before I could reach it, the light vanished. Bigfoot was standing over me. Up close, the size was impossible to process. The shoulders blocked the afternoon sun. The smell hit me first. Wet earth, rotting, vegetation, and something metallic underneath. Then the creature grabbed me. One hand closed around the back of my jacket and lifted me completely off the ground. My boots kicked several feet above the creek bed as I clawed at the fingers crushing the fabric against my throat. The pressure tightened instantly. I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred around the edges. Bigfoot pulled me closer. For the first time, I was close enough to see the details of its face. The scars, the broken teeth, the eyes fixed on me with a level of focus that felt far worse than rage. It wasn't acting on instinct. It knew exactly what it was doing. The creature opened its grip just enough to shift its hold and slammed me into the shale bank beside the creek. Pain exploded through my back. Before it could grab me again, the weakened fabric of my jacket finally tore apart. I dropped into the water. The current carried me several feet downstream before I managed to get my footing. I looked back just in time to see Bigfoot reach into the creek after me. Its hand struck the rock where my head had been moments earlier. The impact shattered the shale and sent fragments spraying across the water. I lunged for my rifle, grabbed it with both hands, and fired. The shot hit something. Bigfoot recoiled and released a scream so violent that I felt it in my chest more than I heard it. The sound rolled through the valley like thunder. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with glass, until the trees finally thinned and the asphalt of the highway appeared. I didn't look back until I was standing in the middle of the road, the sound of my own heartbeat drowning out the wind. I stood on the shoulder of that highway, blood dripping from my shoulder, and my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the rifle. I looked back at the tree line, and for a split second, I saw the shape one last time. It wasn't walking away. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me with a stillness that was more terrifying than the chase. It hadn't let me go. It had simply reached the edge of its hunting ground. The worst part was realizing I had spent 22 days thinking Bigfoot was sending me messages, when it was actually just perfecting its hunt. When I finally reached the highway and stopped shaking enough to think clearly, I started zooming in on the photographs we'd taken at the burial site. That's when I noticed details we hadn't seen while digging. Behind the exposed skeletons, partially hidden beneath roots and dirt, were dozens of personal belongings. Watches, rings, wallets, driver's licenses. Some looked recent. Some looked decades old. Then I noticed something worse. Several of the licenses were positioned beside the skulls. The watches and rings hadn't been buried with the bodies. They had been placed there. The same claw-like markings carved into the trees were cut into the rock behind every set of remains. Every skeleton had personal belongings arranged beside it as if someone had wanted them displayed. It wasn't a burial site. It was a trophy cache. Looking back, every attack started after those photographs were taken, not before. That's why I'm convinced Bigfoot wasn't defending territory. It was trying to eliminate the only witness who had discovered what was hidden in those woods. I am the only one who got away, and I know it's still out there, waiting for the next person to step onto that 40-acre valley. I didn't win. I barely escaped with my life. And somewhere behind those trees is a trophy cache filled with people who weren't as lucky.